will begin the panel with trying to come up with a working definition of Pan-Africanism. And Professor, I think you are in the best position to do that for us. What is Pan-Africanism?
Okay, well, historically, Pan-Africanism is the understanding that Africans, meaning Africans in the continent and Africans in the diaspora, face common problems. Those problems might be enslavement, colonialism, racism, etc. And that as part of the solution to those problems, it's necessary to unite and to fight as one. So it's a conception which is concerned with the liberation of Africa and Africans. At certain points, I don't know whether this person has a microphone, but they sound louder than me. Maybe I should get them to interpret. So at certain times, that unity of Africans has focused more on unity of Africans globally. On some occasions, it's focused more on the unity of the African continent, but always with the perspective that that unity is necessary for the advancement, the liberation of Africans globally. So that's essentially what Pan-Africanism is about. And of course, in different historical periods, it has taken different forms. In the 18th century, in the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, it takes different forms. But that's essentially what it's about.
All right, thank you very much. Seada, what's your take on what Pan-Africanism means today?
Well, what it means, I don't really know what it means. I do know what I would like it to be. I think if I would ask my inner adolescent, idealistic self what Pan-Africanism would look like or what it would be, I think I would want it to be like a big old Wakandan shield around this lump of earth and just protect the shit out of it, you know? That's what I would see as Pan-Africanism. And then, you know, have a long and calm conversation amongst each other about what we think about each other, what we know about each other, what we'd like to do, how we'd like to live, who we'd like to be, where we'd want to live, and just understand each other and start building. That would be my take on Pan-Africanism. It's not the official definition, I know this, but yeah, that would be my dream, for us to start valuing what we have because the rest of the world wants it, and that's why we're in this condition.
Now, obviously this raises an issue. Both definitions raise an issue of, well, we could talk about what the origin of this issue is, which is the issue of the divisions both on the continent. When we talk about the countries we have, who define those countries, and when we talk about nationalism sentiments, what really is that? So I'll take, for example, when a group of people come together with a common interest and a common value and seek for a country, it's a lot different than when a colonial entity creates that country and this group has to figure out what that means to be together. So, and then there is also the divisions amongst those who live on the continent and those who don't live on the continent anymore. And those who don't live on the continent anymore, amongst them are those who were sent away. That's a fancy way of saying possibly taken off the continent against their will. And those who made the decision to leave the continent in search of proverbial greener pastures. Now, how does Pan-Africanism work with all these different groupings? Or what does it mean with this reality of the different groupings, Professor?
Well, you see, I think the first thing to think about is we make a distinction between Africa and the diaspora. Yeah. So on many occasions, that's an arbitrary distinction and division. If you take 500,000 Africans from Africa and you take them to a French colony called Saint-Domingue, and those 500,000 Africans rise up in revolution and liberate themselves. What is that? Is that part of African history? Is it part of Caribbean history? Is it part of world history? Did they cease to be Africans when they landed in the Caribbean? Even though they were born in Africa, they spoke African languages, they had African worldviews, and so on. So we generally say, okay, that's the diaspora. But of course, those people in the diaspora had all kinds of longings and connections with the African continent and so on and so forth. The other day I gave you the example of the West African Students' Union in London. So people went from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone. They organized in London. When they start organizing in London, they become part of the diaspora. Then, while they were in London, they organized branches back in West Africa. So then they then become Africans again. You see, it's in a way, it's a meaningless division. Of course, all the time, what was important about those groupings, those organizations, those activities, well, that Africans were getting together to liberate themselves. Those Africans who were in Haiti, they didn't say, okay, where do you come from? Before we can liberate ourselves, before we can overthrow the French and overthrow the British and overthrow the Spanish, let us first discuss whether we're Yoruba or whether we're Wolof or whether we're, or what are our, no. They didn't organize like that. They organized on the basis of what they had in common, what they needed to deal with at the time, and move forward and so on. So undoubtedly there were all kinds of differences. What languages did they speak? What was their worldview? What was their conception of this and that? But what history remembers is that act of liberation, that act of revolution, that African revolution, the first successful revolution of enslaved people in history. That's what history remembers, not the differences that existed, but that their unity allowed them to liberate ourselves. So I think that's what's important, and we can always look at what divides. And one of the things which divides is that the enemy, if I can use that expression, that neutral expression, the enemy tries to create divisions. So one of the divisions are the colonial constructs in Africa. Then there are other divisions which are, you can say they have an existence in reality in the sense that people speak different languages and so on, but those differences are whipped up, whether they're in Nigeria or whether they're in South Africa or they're in, as we heard this morning, in Rwanda. So in Rwanda, everybody's the same, they speak the same language, have the same worldview and so on. The colonialists come along and say, no, you're not the same, there are three different types of people. And exacerbates those differences and those divisions to such an extent, as Madame Yolande explained this morning, that parents kill children, spouses kill each other because they consider they're all different. So this question of unity, of people uniting to achieve their aims, is one of the most important aspects of Pan-Africanism, overcoming those differences in pursuit of liberation, advance, and so on.
Which brings up the question of back then in history, over history, there seemingly has always been a clearer vision of who or what the enemy was or what the issue that required uniting against the divisions were. So the slaves in San Domingo know we're slaves here, we've been treated so badly, everything else is secondary, we need to get out of this situation. Today, what is it in your view that is so glaringly obvious, or that is so, who is the enemy that would force us to unite?
Well, I think it's several things, but I think it's a legacy of all those things that you just named. I mean, I feel kind of strange talking about Pan-Africanism in this building. You know, we're in a place called Alliance Française. This is where we're holding this venue. I mean, it's lovely. I like it here. But I like the croissants, I like your coffee, everything. But I mean, that is the present situation, right? We are still very much in colonial structures. I mean, colonialism hasn't really ended, especially not by the French, who are really working really hard every day to keep things the way they are, you know? So I could elaborate, but I think
please do. I think the croissants are already out. They can't take it away. So just go all the way and then come with me when we leave.
Okay, I'm not running, I have heels. Not possible, I don't run. But no, even though I'm Ethiopian, I don't run. But anyway, no, I think, I think the realities are not, I mean, of course they're different, but the consequences of those things, the present form of it is not that different, I think. I mean, if you look at the language you're speaking at the moment, what is your ethnicity?
I'm Igbo.
Igbo. What is your ethnicity, Professor? Okay. Do you speak each other's languages?
I speak the English part.
No. Do you know what I mean?
No, I do.
I said each other's languages.
Yeah. No, but he said he was Yoruba and English.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you speak his language? I don't think I need to make a point. We're both with two people of Nigerian heritage, and the language that connects you is English.
But taking off of his example with the case in San Domingo, for example, they probably didn't all speak the same language.
You mean back then?
Yes,
and
even back then.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, we have been put in nation states that have pushed everybody together, and then a language was imposed that is coming from the outside. So I think it affects the way we think. It affects the way we dream. It affects the way what we read. It affects the authors that are presented to us. It affects the media that we see. Because I think, I don't know if the people in the audience follow news in other African countries, but I think it mostly comes to you through BBC Africa and not through a Pan-African station that we all follow and that we love and that we support. So it's about all those structures that we're still in, even though it's called different, even though there's independence. What type of independence are we really talking about? The biggest company here is Shell, Dutch, British. Yeah. So I think those structures have just changed faces and become multinationals, but they're not very different from before, if you ask me. There's an author here in the audience who's written a book called Heineken in Africa. Heineken is a Dutch company. It's very influential on this continent. So we need to look at those things. We need to look at our leaders. And when I say our, I sometimes feel weird talking about this because I live in Europe. I live in the Netherlands, even though I was born in Ethiopia. So sometimes I feel like, is it my place? This is actually the thing that the professor was talking about. Who is the African, right? I feel like I said in the beginning, I feel like there's so much to protect. There's so much to preserve. And I think we need everybody on the globe to do that, to feel like we have a unified force to do something. This festival is an example where we can have conversations, we can ask tough questions, we can get to know each other. I think that's all helpful. But I think we need to understand that we're doing this in this structure. And that needs to change.
I think two things occurred to me. One is that we tend to forget the divisions which existed historically. If one goes into the Haitian Revolution, there were all kinds of divisions. If one looks at the anti-colonial struggle, for example, anywhere in Africa, all these differences and divisions which we're discussing, they existed during that period and so on. But people still managed to organize themselves to overcome these divisions, to advance their interests and so on. So, in one sense, Pan-Africanism is just a recognition of the importance of uniting in order to advance people's interests, advance their struggle for liberation, and so on. And in fact, many of those struggles in Africa, which were most successful, involved organizations and politics which precisely enable that unity of people not only speaking different languages, having different kinds of societies, all kinds of things. But history has shown the possibilities. What we're now discussing are the structures which still prevent people fulfilling their goals, if you like, which prevent people truly liberating themselves. But you could say that is something which everybody has in common, that everybody in Africa is living in a colonially constructed polity. So that's one thing that they have in common. Everybody in Africa, generally speaking, is living under alien, Eurocentric political institutions. That's something else all Africans have in common. Thirdly, all Africans are living under what I would call the capital-centered system. That's something else that all Africans have in common. Now, if you go back to the Pan-African Congress in 1945, it was a long time ago, these were precisely the things that people discussed at that Congress and said, these are the things that we need to get rid of. The borders, the capital-centered system, the alien political institutions, because if we don't get rid of these alien political institutions, we will continue to be enslaved and so on. But in some ways, because we maybe don't learn the lessons of history as thoroughly as we need to, then we maybe don't recognize these things. Some people are still unclear about the political institutions. They think, okay, well, maybe it hasn't worked for 60 years, but at the next election it will work. Or people are not clear about the capital-centered system. It hasn't trickled down yet, but next year it might trickle down. No, it's never going to trickle down. Africa is never going to be developed under that system for the benefit of the majority of people. So these are things which people in the continent have in common. They're common problems. And the question is, to what extent can people unite both within countries to overcome these problems, but also continentally in order to overcome these problems? And so so that overcoming, that people coming together to address these issues, you could say is what modern Pan-Africanism requires or needs to direct itself to.
So just to follow up on that point, sir, back then, and I keep using this distinction of back then, 1945, these 3 points were what served as a point of unity amongst very varied groups, people from all parts of the world who had one thing in common, their African heritage. It wasn't important if they were from the diaspora, if they were sold as slaves, if they were from the Nigerian colonial construct. These issues transcended all of that, and then there was a sense of unity and almost urgency towards doing something about it. What changed? Because like Seada is pointing out, these issues are still very present, but rather than having a rise in that drive, because there was so much momentum, we've had a dulling to the point where Seada now feels, should I even be commenting on this? Where, and then we talk about, oh, no. In terms of authenticity, we need to consider, is this a person from the diaspora? Is this a person? How did we get here?
Okay, well, that's a long history, but let me give one example, because although these problems were identified, not only were the problems identified, but the solution to the problems was identified. Because in 1945 they identified, you could say they really made a summation of history, what's happened over the last 15, 20 years and so on. So they concluded that, well, a number of things. One, that there was no point going to the colonial powers and saying, excuse me, do you mind if we liberate ourselves? What they said was, no, we need to be our own liberators. We need to use force if necessary, and the main human force which is going to end colonial rule are the masses of the people. that is the wealth producers, the workers, the farmers, and so on. If that force is organized, nothing can stop it. And they said that because, as people know, in 1945 there was a general strike in Nigeria. The whole country came to a standstill. In the 1930s, there were massive strikes throughout the Caribbean. The whole of the colonial system was under threat. So they recognized that this force, if organized and harmonized, can do anything, can solve any problem. However, unfortunately, in the anti-colonial struggles, although sometimes that force was organized and unleashed, we can say it wasn't unleashed to its full potential. And at the same time, many of the leaders were afraid of that force. That if this force actually takes power, what's going to become of us? So they made various compromises. One was to then adopt the system, the political institutions, the economic system, which they had criticized, which they said was no good. They said, oh no, let us have this system. Let's have these elections. Let's have whatever. So they compromised, and much of that compromise took place during the Cold War, when it was, when the big powers made it more difficult for them to maybe to take the measures that they wanted to take. I'm simplifying, but that's the essence of it. And so, as you say, we're now stuck with these oppressive systems, the same ones they identified in 1945. But you could argue that the same solution presents itself, that if the people can empower themselves, then everything is possible. Just like the people of what became Haiti empowered themselves. You know, in Haiti, the life expectancy was 7 years. 7 years. But they didn't say, oh, well, maybe, you know, what can we do? They did something. They recognized that there was an alternative. It was in their interest. They needed to unite, and they did all these things. They showed that anything is possible. So similar problems exist today, and these problems don't just exist in Africa, because they also exist in Europe. They also exist in America, or wherever you want to go. But the majority of us, even though we're highly educated or whatever, we're not decision makers. We don't have any decision-making power, so how do we resolve that problem? Because if we did, then we would be able to resolve all of these things. We'd say, okay, let us have a political system that favors us. Let us have an economic system that favors us, that puts healthcare first, that puts education first, that puts providing electricity first, that puts providing water first. But we don't have that. So these systems are run in the interests of others. And we know how they run because in Europe, we've had these systems for 350 years. And they've never favored the majority of people. So why would they favor the majority of people in Africa? It's not possible.
Seada, yes, your thoughts?
I just have a question. Don't you think that there's less of a common goal right now?
Less
of a common goal? I mean...
No, I don't think that. I think that globally, you could say I won't use the word propaganda, I use the word disinformation. The disinformation of the powers that be is at an all-time high. So they will tell you anything and everything. First they tell you there's no alternative. This is democracy. This is it. Isn't it wonderful? There's nothing else. So, okay, it may not be perfect, but this is all there is. Then they create divisions amongst people. They say, no, the problem isn't these political institutions and this economic system. It's all these foreigners coming into South Africa. That's the problem. Or the problem is it's all these northerners. Or it's these southerners. Or it's those people in the east. Or whatever. Or it's the immigrants. Or all of these things. So all kinds of things are said to divert people. And then, of course, they have organizations which the people may have created, like, say, trade unions, but they manage to put their people at the head of them. Yeah. I hope I'm not upsetting anybody. No, okay.
We're well past that.
So then those people direct things in a certain way. okay, yeah, you can strike, but maybe you just strike for maybe a few higher wages or something, that you just keep it confined. Even though you're the most powerful force in the country, don't exercise that power. Don't empower yourselves. Don't demand the earth. Just demand a little bit, and with a bit of struggle, we may give you that little bit. So there are various mechanisms which exist, again, not just Nigeria, not just Africa, but they exist in Britain, they exist in the US. There's press, there's TV, there's media, there's a whole range of things which are used to create confusion. People know from their own experience what is required. We all know what is required. It's not a mystery. But these diversions and this disinformation is so strong that people, you know. And then the other thing, of course, they have the state. So if you begin to organize a bit too much, then okay, then they arrest you. And if you organize a bit further, then they may do something else. And in history, we've seen all those things. And of course, they did that in Haiti. But if people keep going and have the confidence and the vision that, yes, the future is ours, then all these things can be achieved.
Professor Adi mentioned the press. You're a journalist, and you've done quite a bit of work on issues bordering on the image of Africa. In a recent interview you did with, I can't pronounce the name, so I hope you'll be able to recognize it, Asfa Bidna. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, she made a comment during that interview. She said, many sources in education about slavery, racism, and Africa are white and old. And she goes on to point out how a lot of those views are just not correct. And part of the project she works on in Netherlands is infusing in the educational curriculum pardon me for using this in quotes, the right view on African history. Professor Adi was the first professor of African studies of African descent, if I'm not mistaken. And there's not that much of him. I mean, he's kind of like a white rhino or a pink elephant, an endangered species of sorts. But coming down to the media and to the press, do you see this as an issue where even the narratives that are spun are those that favor these structures that, rather than inspiring towards making changes, are actually having an opposite effect?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, okay, of course, from the perspective of the Netherlands, I was actually the only Africa editor for a national newspaper, or for any newspaper, or any media outlet of African descent. So, or who was born in Africa, or had African ties, or, and I made it my business to really stop using certain language. You know, what most, you know, I think a lot of things have changed in the meantime, but I got in a lot of trouble by criticizing my colleagues. I once wrote a piece saying Africa doesn't exist, because what triggered it was a very senior journalist, and by that time I was just beginning. So there was a very senior journalist who has been a correspondent in Africa for a long time, and it was about his, I don't know, 25th anniversary or something. He got interviewed, and he was what he thought was complimenting Africa became such a stereotypical story on how Africans are resilient and rhythmical and just all these weird stereotypes, and then he got so much praise for that interview that I wrote an opinion piece online saying that I was kind of sick of my colleagues who cover Africa, who determine the image of Africa, not just for a white audience, but for the general public also, and not thinking about Africans reading that as well. And how I didn't expect that from somebody that I respected and from somebody that everybody looks up to, that he has such a simple outlook on Africa and such a, well, actually colonial view of the continent and its people. And so that was one of the things I really tried to change. I made sure that whenever I wrote about any part of Africa, I made sure that the persons speaking on it were the experts. I don't mean Africans as decor, because that's a very common thing. Africans can come by to complain about something or say how they're a victim, but they're never the experts. For expertise, they call somebody in London or at the crisis group in, I don't know. So it's such a weird thing, because if you have to write a piece on Italy, you don't call Nigeria and ask somebody, do you know something about Italy? You don't do that, but that happens to Africa a lot. And that's why you get these distorted views, and that's why I think you also get this idea that the information we get about Africa, if it's history or current, it's determined by people, mostly determined by people who have no real interest in the continent being portrayed in a just way. And that's very dangerous, because it means that we don't control the story that's told about us. And I don't think this has changed a lot, because I left and I became chief editor of my own magazine. But even in my magazine, I make sure that recently we did a story on the cyclone in southern Africa, in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and it was terrible. And so I wanted it to be written by a journalist in that region. Now that means that that's extra cost, it's translation, it's also not just translation of words, but also translation of the way of writing, and how you transfer information. But I really want to do those things. I want to invest in that. I want to spend more money, because it actually gives you a much better story and a different story. So yeah, that's the strategy I use.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, so what's the way forward then?
The way forward is we need many, many, many more storytellers coming from the continent, being hired by big news organizations, and not just as stringers, because this is what happens all the time. So foreign correspondents, or even correspondents living here or just flying in, will come in, they know nothing about Nigeria, and they're like, I need to know something. I've been that person as well. I don't know anything, but I need to make 10 stories in a month, and they just hire actual journalists here, and they call them stringers. They're just helpers, and they don't end up in the story, but they're the ones doing a lot of work. They have the connections, they prepare things, they do whatever, and the journalist walks away with the Pulitzer Prize, the one, from the West. So these people need actual jobs. They can do the same job. You can hire them. So that's what needs to change. Also, it's a very illogical system to me, because you're paying 3 people instead of 1 and providing jobs here.
Now, another component of this is the economic liberation of people, of Africans all over the place. What do you think about shifting the focus of the market from the West back to the African continent? So, for example, these stories are being paid for by media houses somewhere in the US and UK. What about media houses here? How do we get media houses here to think about making those kinds of investments?
It's difficult, because of course media is very expensive. I know this. I know what it takes to make a magazine every month. It's very, very, very expensive. So you need money. You also need freedom. You need a government that will let you do your job and not use you as promotion or for propaganda. A lot of journalists in Africa, they struggle with the fact that they can only make a living if they also do a lot of propaganda work for governments. They call it the brown envelope. You just show up at this, just come to my press conference, and then you'll have your monthly thing, and then maybe you can do some other stories on the side. So there is it's difficult. I mean, it would take private money. There's a lot of money in a country like Nigeria. Invest in the press. Invest in free press. Not just in, I don't know what people invest in. But anyway, it takes a lot of private investment, and it takes courage, and it's very, very necessary. And I think it will also help a lot of other things, because if you have the right press, it means you have the right investments. If you have the wrong stories coming out of your country, because it's, you know, there is a lens that is not yours, then it's negative for a lot of other things that you're trying to build. So yeah, I think, and also I think there should be state press as well, but that should be free as well, free from interference. And that is not the case in most of the African countries. And Nigeria is actually well off compared to other African countries.
Okay. Professor Adi.
I mean, again, I was going to turn to history for a response, because if you look at, say you look at the anti-colonial press in Africa or elsewhere, that was not we wouldn't call that a free press. In many cases, you know, journalists, it was difficult for people to write things or difficult for people to print things. Very often the most important and advanced ideas had to be, it was a political issue, let me put it that way. You know, many things were, not just in one country, but even continentally, things were smuggled into the African continent so that people could read. So, in other words, there was a conception there of an alternative press, that we have to create our own media. That is to say, those of us who recognize that there's something wrong with the existing media, it's not just a question of joining the existing media, though there may be a role there, but what about an alternative media which favors the interests of the people, which speaks the truth, which is not owned by millionaires and billionaires who use the press, the media, the TV in their interests? We have the capacity of developing an alternative to that, especially today with social media. So many things are possible. Everybody can create a whole range of things: film, podcast, whatever, print, you know, word. So I think that's important. And again, that's kind of learning the lessons of history, that, you know, we have the capacity to do these things and to create things which speak to people in their own languages, in the idioms that they understand, and so on. And I think the more of that that's done, the better. And of course, not just in the continent, but also elsewhere. That's also very important, because that enables people to address the problems they want to address, not to be in any way constrained or confined by the millionaires and billionaires.
But how would this be funded?
Well, in the same way that the alternative press has always been funded. That, you know, when we say we are our own liberators, then that's what it means. We have to find the ways of doing these things. How did the West African Students' Union finance their glossy monthly publication? How did Marcus Garvey finance Negro World? How did those, you know, one can go on and on and on. There's so many examples.
Well, how did they?
Yeah, I was going to say, the answer is in his book, Pan-Africanism and the History, but it's a very big book. So could you tell us quickly from the book, how did they do that?
It's not a very big book. If you want a big book, I can show you a big book, because I've written a big book as well. This is a short book. And this is why we have to create our own publicity, because if we rely on other people to publicize things for us, we never get anywhere. Okay? So it's a brief book. It's very readable. It's very accessible. It has a contents page. It has an index, and you can go and look for all these things yourself.
And I have read the book. I should add that.
So then you should answer the question then.
Oh, here we go. Now, just to prove a point, basically you put your money where your mouth is. If you claim you believe in something, then that should actually be shown not just in your words, but in your actions, and that includes your money. So these groups made it a point to raise funds amongst those people who supported the ideas that they believed in, and that was what kept them going.
I mean, again, a good example, as we're in Nigeria, is West African Students' Union needed to raise money, both for publicity and for, in those days in Britain, racism was legal, so they didn't have anywhere to stay. So that they actually sent one of their members back to Africa to raise money in Africa. And then after 3 years of fundraising, he came back to Britain and they had some funds to do some of the things that they wanted to do. They used to have fundraising events throughout West Africa as well as in Britain and other places and so on. They used to have meetings in all the major churches and so on and raise money. So there are numerous examples of how you raise money. Other people have other ideas and so on. So there are these possibilities. If we want to do these things, if we think they are necessary, then we always have to find the ways of doing them. And I think that those alternative things which we control, which we finance, where we provide the ideas and so on, to me that's much more important. That alternative media is what needs to be continually developed.
Now, another issue that's raised in the discussions from describing what we were going to talk about in the panel was the rise of the Asian tigers, led, of course, by China and the Belt Road Initiative. Now, when talking about that initiative and what China is trying to do, oftentimes the subtext that's missed is that China is trying to advance China's interests. And anyone else who's benefiting anything seemingly from that is just a secondary beneficiary of the primary Chinese interest. And we know that China is committed to the idea, at least, of some of these large infrastructure projects in Africa, but to serve Chinese interests. Now, how do you see, what kind of response do you expect from people of African heritage? And I use this to include even those in the diaspora or anywhere who have interests in Africa. What kind of response do you see from a Pan-African perspective to address these kinds of issues? I mean, on the one hand, we need good roads, we need large projects, we can't fund them. Someone's coming in with money, they're saying, I'll build that road, I'll do it for you, I won't charge you too much of a loan. But then maybe 10 years from now, I'll own the road, I'll own that airport, and I'll own the people who work there. But right now, I need for my election to say, I built a road, I built an airport, and 4 years from now, I'll leave the country, so it's not my problem, it's you guys' problem. How do Pan-Africanists respond to this reality?
See, I think the first thing is, we're in Nigeria, which is the biggest economy in Africa. So even the concept that there is no money to invest in Nigeria, and there are no wealthy Nigerians is a kind of interesting concept. So that is one question. Let's just take Nigeria as an example. Why is it that Nigeria's economy is in a state that it needs that kind of foreign investment? That to me is the first question that has to be addressed. How is it that it's got to such a state that it needs that? Why is it unable to develop on its own? If it continually is looking for foreign investment, it's always going to be in the same state. It's always going to be enslaved in one form or another. So I can't see how that can possibly be seen as a solution. The other thing is that the role of China in Africa, as well as other parts of the world, also has to be seen in the context of what people call the new scramble for Africa. So China it's not just that China is acting alone, it's acting with the other BRICS, it's acting with the EU, or it's in contention with the EU, it's in contention even with the other BRICS, it's in contention with the US. So whatever angle the Chinese government takes is not only in its interest, but if you could say in rivalry with the interests of the other big powers. So those people who know their history or anything about history will know that the reason we talk about a new scramble is because there was an old scramble. So the old scramble ended with what? The old scramble ended with the First World War. Because when the contention between the big powers in Africa couldn't be advanced in any other way, and when the whole of Africa was already divided between the big powers, the only way they could resolve their differences was by going to war. And those who won the war then redivided Africa again. and took the colonies of those who had lost the war. So in that sense, the scramble itself is extremely dangerous. It may not have got to that dangerous extent today, although we already see the consequences of it. That the big powers are fighting amongst themselves in a whole range of ways. They fight economically, they're fighting militarily, they're establishing their bases all over Africa. They have their troops all over Africa. They have their navies encircling Africa. They're presenting all kinds of so-called soft power. Sometimes it's loans, sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that, with 1,001 strings attached somewhere along the line. You know that if we take Britain as an example, just to give another example, in the British economy, we've gone through a period of so-called austerity where everything is cut. The only thing that isn't cut is overseas aid. The aid budget always is maintained or increases. Why is that? Is that because the British government is philanthropic and they have the interests of Africans and other people? No, it's not. Because that so-called aid they give is essentially a subsidy to their own multinational companies. They give you the subsidy and they say privatize this. They give you the subsidy and they say buy this. This is how these things work, and history shows all of this. There's no mystery about these things. So again, we have to understand how these things work and take the appropriate action, you could say, or at least discuss these things in this way. Because very often the governments of these countries act in a different way. They don't act in the interests of the country or the interests of the majority of people. So I think that those developments, including China, are very dangerous developments. The other thing, of course, is to look at the nature of China's economy. What is that all about? What's going on in China? What are their problems? And what are they trying to solve by doing what they're doing?
Seada, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree. I think in the beginning, I thought it was kind of refreshing or something. Like, they don't have colonial ties. It's kind of a clean, clean transaction. You get my resources, I build your road or whatever. But it's become much more complicated and much more problematic along the way because of the extent, but also because of it seems like there's a very clean, it's a clean-cut deal, but it's not, because China is building and has built. There are here in Nigeria as well, Confucius Institutes. They have imperialistic tendencies, and it's not getting a lot of attention. So it's not just we're looking for economic gain. They're also trying to, they're trying to infiltrate the minds as well. And actually the same goes for Turkey. Turkey also has these institutes everywhere. Who's clapping? Oh, no. Oh. So, so it's much more than just, or if you look at like the Horn of Africa, what's going on there, there's like a fight between Turkey and the Gulf, and, so we need to be really vigilant about all these different developments, and just because it's a different face, it doesn't mean it's a different structure. I keep coming back to that.
Yeah. So how do we respond to this in particular? Because in responding to these powers, they're called powers because they are powerful. And I read somewhere that there is no single African nation that is in a position to defend itself against an external aggressor. So if push comes to shove and you have to do it, a lot of countries feel, well, we have to do it because the alternative is we can't defend ourselves.
Do you mean military-wise?
Yes, militarily.
I don't think that's true, though. I mean, there's so many big armies in Africa that could, but they're divided, and they're being governed by foreign sovereignties. So Ethiopia used to be, called the police of the Horn for the longest time because they fought wars, proxy wars, wars in other countries, in Somalia, but then that was instructed by the Americans or instructed by the Europeans. So it's not that we don't have military organization. We do. But is that the road you want to go in? Or do you just want to change your economical system and think about what we can do together, you know, and what can we do without, I mean, and also what can we do to use all the you know, the talent that we have around the globe, and let them build those roads, let them lead all these great infrastructural projects. And I guess that's not really happening. I mean, Ghana now has called 2019 the year of return, and they're trying to repatriate, you know, all types of Africans, maybe African American or people from the Caribbean. I guess you could call it like a big marketing stunt, or, you know, it's quite commercial, I guess. But in a way, maybe it's a beginning. I don't know. I don't want to be like, I was kind of skeptical about it, but I think I don't want to be too. No, I don't want to be too critical of it. Let's see what happens. You know, at least something's moving, something's happening, something's being organized. I don't know.
I think the other thing is that we have a continental organization. So then the question is, what is that continental organization doing to defend the continent and its interests? So, and how do, even given its limitations and its weaknesses, how do we, or those of us who have the capability and the possibility, how do we try to ensure to actually strengthen the AU? You know, it's a far from perfect, just as the OAU was far from perfect. But then there are occasions when the OAU acted as a continental organization, with regard to apartheid being the obvious example. So because it was recognized that that was a threat, and settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism were a threat to the entire continent. So, in fact, if you look at the creation of the AU, it was originally as a bulwark against neoliberal globalization. That was the intention. But then what happened, and it went down a different road. So it raises a question of how to strengthen that organization, or to demand of that organization that it acts in the interests of the continent, or to find ways to turn it into an instrument which at least can stand up and say these things. So these are also political questions that have to be discussed, and people, you know, work out the solution to them. One can't just dismiss what exists. How can it be utilized? Or how can the people create something of their own, if that is what is required, to stand up on behalf of the continent? Or
how can we use the African Union, which is just basically a building, you know, it's just a building, there's nothing else. It's sitting in Addis Ababa, but there's nothing real happening there to protect the interests of Africa and Africans. And recently, right now, actually, there's a conflict with an AU ambassador, a woman from Zimbabwe, I don't know if you heard this, who was fired because she said it's ridiculous that France is still so, controlling the economies and the treasuries of most of their former colonies. And this is a very, very big problem, and she's right. And she got fired by the AU that is supposed to protect African interests. Now, this is the world upside down. Yeah. So you work for the AU, you're doing your job, and you get fired for doing your job. So, you know, this is the situation we're in right now. The African Union, and I think not just the African Union, but African leaders do not respond to Africa or to Africans. They still respond to the former colonies. They respond to the IMF. They respond to the World Bank. You think you're choosing a leader for you, but that's not really true.
So we're almost out of time. So let's answer, we're out of time? Okay, so we're almost out of time. Let's just answer one question, which is in the title of this panel. So is Pan-Africanism then a fantasy? Is it something that is a practical reality that we could work towards and see? Or is it a fantasy, something that we could see the possibility of it happening at some point, but... Well,
are we answering this?
I think we should let Africans answer that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So that's the question we're throwing to you at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, to answer the question, I want to bring our minds back to something the professor said, which is that the critical mass needs to unite, needs to become actively involved in developing the African nation. And as to the role of the African Union, I reflect on something that happened, in 2011, just to summarize. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was murdered on the streets of Libya, and it's being touted now, or that's one of the possible reasons was that he was suggesting that Africa starts to trade its hydrocarbons for gold rather than the United States, dollar. And I just want to say that for us to get to the point where we're able to be self-sufficient, to compete with the rest of the global community on an equal plane where we don't need aid anymore, we do need to kind of take that stance collectively. We do need to define the terms of our association and of our trade particularly, because without money and without control of resources, then none of this will actually happen. And just finally, as a point to Sead, the building, in fact, was built by Mike Adenuga, right, and is only being managed by the Alliance Française. So that's a positive.
I love that. Thank you.
We are just here to help connection, thank you, between everyone, including the French speakers. I have here my friend from Djibouti, is a French speaker, you see. So, yes, it's a misunderstanding. And just to finish about that, Mike Adenuga is the president of Colonial, and Colonial is a Nigerian, also petrol. So, thank you for saying that. And last thing, in Addis Ababa, I'm Abesha also. I was in Addis, and Addis was Alliance Ethio-Française, and it was an Ethiopian center, just as he said.
I just want to know who's paying you, who's paying your salary.
Alors, very interesting. All the alliances in the world are local institutions.
No, who's paying your salary?
It's a Nigerian association.
No, okay, but who's paying your salary?
Me only. I am paid by the French government.
Aha,
Only.
thank you.
But Alliance Française de Lagos is a Nigerian association led by a Nigerian board who can sack me every day if he wants. I hope no.
But the next one will be paid by the French government
All right,
as well.
we'll take one more comment from the gentleman right here, because our time is totally up. This is a conversation. We're still going to be in Alliance Française till tomorrow, right? We're still going to be here, so we could continue this conversation.
Of course we're still going to be here.
No,
Okay, my name is Olatunji. I think the big elephant in the room is a global system that seems to perpetuate the economic disempowerment of the continent in itself. Because you find more and more numbers of Africans are drifting into extreme poverty year in, year out. And we have a population growth that also seems to be exceeding economic growth. And we have a near zero productive contribution to the global system. So I don't know, it just doesn't seem like there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I wanted to ask a question that how does a new Africa that is possible, how does it intersect with the contribution of the diaspora? Because there's an obvious brain drain happening right now. And so you have almost an empty intellectual environment within the continent.
I think that's a great question, and I will let Seada, because
I didn't really get the question, I'm sorry.
Part of the question was kind of in two parts. One of it was the fact that it seems like there is a global structure to keep things the way they are, and to kind of disenfranchise African people. And at the same time, this system kind of filters away the best, draining away best minds, the best...
The brain drain.
The brain drain, the resource drain. So we have raw materials here. The resources are going elsewhere. We have talented minds, but they're headed out of the country. And the system is going down. And he's asking, so essentially, how do we change this? How do we turn this around? And I think in throwing that question here, I realized that we cannot possibly answer that question in the no time that we have. So what I would recommend is that immediately we get up from here, you grab a hold of Seada, you grab a hold of Professor Adi. Don't come to me. And
thank you for the
this
question.
conversation.
But can I just say very, very briefly, let's look at it the other way around. Okay, so Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa, for example. And we know that there are various people who have pocketed wealth and so on. So the question is, who creates all this wealth? So the creation of this wealth, it's not created by the people who steal it. It's not created by the government. It's created by people who work, people who produce things, people who farm. So the question is how those people who produce everything, who produce the oil, who produce the yam, who produce the groundnuts, who produce the pot, or whatever, how those who produce all this wealth can take control of this wealth that they produce and use it for their own interests so that we have all the things we need. We have a health system, we have education, we have electricity, we have water, we have all these things. It's as simple as that. The difficulty is that those who have their hands have developed a system to keep themselves in that position and to deny us the possibility of taking hold of what we have created and what is ours. So we have to find a way of preventing them from stopping us from taking what is ours. When we can find out how to do that, and history has provided us many examples, when we can empower ourselves and become decision makers, then we take hold of what is ours and we use it for our benefit. Then all these problems will be solved.
Thank you very much. Please let's give another round of applause to Professor Adi. A round of applause for Seada. And a round of applause for me. Thank you very much.